If you're joining us here for the first time or you're visiting here today, we really want to say a warm welcome. Really glad to have you with us. We're busy in the moment. We're right at the end of a series that we have been doing the last 4 weeks. And the series is entitled, When the Game is Over, It All Goes Back in the Box. Through the series, we've learned a number of lessons about this very true principle in life. And that is, one of the important things we need to remember is we need to be investing in what is eternal over what is temporal. So much of this life, so much of the things we gather, so much of the success, so much of what many people place value and significance on is all going to be nothing at the end. As the title says, when the game is over, when life ends, it will all just go back in the box. And so we need to be investing in what is eternal over what is temporal. Then in week 2, we looked at keeping score. How so often we try and keep score, or the way the world tells us to keep score, by comparing, by competing. And I guess sometimes climbing the ladder of success often doesn't actually help us achieve any amount of victory or any amount of satisfaction in this game of life. And so the challenge was, let us keep score the way God keeps score. Let us not fall into the traps and compete and compare with others. Then last week, Karen spoke to us about our calling. That in each and every one of our lives, God has placed a call. God has placed a call, and He has placed a challenge to resist comfort, but to take up His call in your life. Because you see, comfort can so often be the enemy of the call that God has placed in your life. And the world often entices us. Just be comfortable, look after yourself, feed yourself. Whereas the challenge was, and I know many of you responded to the challenge last week, to respond and listen to God's call in your life. You decided we don't and we can't just sit anymore. We are embracing life's true meaning and purpose and significance as we respond to the call that God has placed. And so I want to commend you this morning on that decision, on your commitment. Well done for making that stand. But I want you to know this in light of that decision. Your calling, the call of God, the call that is placed on your life is a journey, not a destination. A decision is only the beginning, the first steps in this ultra marathon called life. Paul often talks about this life of faith, this decision to follow God's call. He often talks about it using sporting imagery. And I want us to turn to a verse where Paul talks about this, and it's in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24 and 27. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24 to 27. Paul here, he's talking to the church in Corinth, and in talking about this life of faith, or living a life of faith, he says, don't you realize that in a race, everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize? So run to win. All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we do it for an eternal prize. And see here, Paul highlights this whole principle again. Most athletes, most people competing in sports, they do it for a prize that will fade away. That when the game is over, it will all go back in the box. But we, the race of life, the race of faith, we are engaging in something that is eternal. So I run with purpose in every step. And I'm not just showboxing or punching the air. I discipline my body like an athlete in training to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself may be disqualified. So here Paul uses this interesting imagery of a race to describe a life of faith. Now, where does he get this imagery? What is he talking about here? See, Paul lived back 2,000 years ago, and he's speaking to a Greek church in a Greek city of Corinth. And what he was referring to, what he was talking about when he's using the sporting language, is something that we're about to celebrate in the world in just a few weeks' time. Who can tell me what that is? The Olympic Games. All the churches or all the places that Paul often visited, like in Galatia, in Ephesus, in Corinth, in Athens, in Sparta, or wherever it was, all knew and understood what he was talking about when he spoke about athletes competing in the games. Because all of Greece was fascinated and interested in these Olympic Games. Now, one other reason what many people believe why Paul was familiar and knew a lot about these games is Paul was a tent maker by profession. And for these games, the athletes that were going to compete in them would come from all parts of the world, and they would have to camp and stay around the stadium or in the city where the games were, most often Athens. And in order to stay there wasn't enough accommodation in the city. They would have to pitch tents. And in these tents live for a number of months during the games. And so this was most likely a lucrative business for Paul, who was a tent maker. And so you can imagine as he's there busy supplying tents for a lot of these athletes, he's spending time with them, talking to them, watching some of these games, and a lot of the imagery he's seeing, a lot of the principles are speaking to him as he watches these athletes, as he mingles with them. And so we see another time in Philippians 3, verse 13, and you can follow along in your Bible. Sorry, I didn't give you the page number for the previous one, but this is on page 709. Philippians 3, verse 13. He says, "No, dear brothers and sisters, I've not achieved it yet, but I focus on this one thing. Forgetting the past and looking forward to what lies ahead, I press on. I press on to reach the end of the race and receive the heavenly prize for which God, through Christ Jesus, is calling us." I want to touch on one thing that Paul alludes to here, and that is when he uses the words press on to the prize in this race. He touches on a truth that we often don't like, a truth that often sits uncomfortably with us. In our desire for comfort and ease, we often shun this principle. It is one that we all know works well for us when we're going to the gym. How many of you go to the gym? Yes? Okay. It's one we all know works well for us when we go to the gym. But we have trouble accepting it in other areas of our life. And here is the principle: no pain, no gain. Okay, how many of you can testify to that? No pain, no gain. Often the greatest joy and satisfaction in life comes after moments of great pain and suffering. Speak to any mother who has given birth and she'll testify to this. Speak to any athlete who achieves success and victory. They will tell of their pain, their sacrifice and suffering it took to get them to that point. Speak to any artistic maestro and they will recount the many hours of practice and discipline that went into their art, into their music. All these people will also tell you about the moments in their journey they wanted to give up. The moments in their journey that they felt it was getting tough, was just getting too hard. The pain, the agony, the anguish, the torture was becoming too much. And they wanted to give up. A defining moment in their journey. Now, I was exposed to this reality and talking about running races and talking about sports. I was exposed to this reality from an early age in life. You see, I have a father who's a keen marathon runner. How many of us here are marathon runners? Okay, I'm sure we've got a few. He's a keen marathon runner, and his marathon exploits and living in South Africa inevitably led him and his friend Costas Chrysafis to a marathon, an ultra-marathon known as the Comrades Marathon, the oldest and longest ultra-marathon in the world. Now, they celebrated this event just last week. I don't know if many of you were aware of it. but I, for various reasons, spent most of my Sunday last week glued to the TV watching this marathon. The run is between two cities in South Africa, Pietermaritzburg and Durban. The race covers 90 kilometers of unforgiving terrain and has a height variation of 800 meters, from 800 meters above sea level down or up 800 meters. The race was founded in the 1920s in commemoration of fallen comrades, soldiers who fought in the First World War. And the purpose of the race, and this is what I want us to keep in mind, the purpose of this race was to celebrate mankind's spirit of adversity, spirit over adversity. The purpose of the race, to celebrate mankind's spirit over adversity. Of the 20,000 people that run each year, very few run to win the race. Very few are even competing with others in the race. Of the 20,000, there's probably only a handful that would consider themselves contenders to win, but all of them have trained, have gone through discipline and sacrifice, other runs to try and qualify. All of them have spent the time and put the energy into training and preparing for this race. Their goal during the race is not to compete with each other, but rather to celebrate each other, to support and encourage one another as they battle against the course and against the time. 12 hours is all they have, no more. As a young boy, I remember every year making the pilgrimage from where we lived in the center of South Africa down to the east coast of Natal to go and watch my father and his good friend run this marathon, this ultra marathon every year. The city would be abuzz with anticipation, excitement, as all the runners were there with great fear and excitement and anticipation at all the same time. The race begins while it's still dark. The runners huddled close together in an attempt, 1, to get to the start line, 2, to keep warm, and then just logistically trying to fit 20,000 people on a narrow portion of road. Songs are played for inspiration. The national anthem, Shosholoza, and then the race anthem, Chariots of Fire. A cock crows, a gun fires, and months of training and sacrifice are called upon as runners set off on the race. All along the way, spectators line the streets, cheering, encouraging, sharing food and drink. They reckon over 100,000 spectators fill the course during that day. There is a feature in the race that is strategically located near the halfway point. And this feature they call the Wall of Remembrance. This is a wall made up of bricks. I know most walls are made up of bricks. But this one, each brick bears a name. And on the name is a runner who has previously run the course and finished the race, who has endured, who has got through, who has pushed through the pain barrier and been successful in finishing the race. And you see, they place this Hall of Fame strategically near the halfway point because they reckon it's there at the halfway point, near the highest point in the route, after one of the most difficult hills that you've had to climb, that they have the highest attrition rate. The highest rate of people deciding, you know what, I can't anymore. This is too hard. The pain is too unbearable. The mental anguish is too challenging. I can't do it anymore. I want to give up. And as you reach that point, as you're about to go through, I guess, that challenge of giving up, there is this wall. And as you run past this wall, there's hundreds and thousands of names of people who have been at this point, who have experienced what you're experiencing, who have felt what it is to go through the very pain and suffering that you are, but yet who have been successful. And their names stand as a testimony, as a witness to their endurance in the race. It reminds me of a part of the Bible where it also uses this running of a race type metaphor. And I invite you to turn there to Hebrews chapter 12. It's on page 733 in the Bible in the seat pocket in front of you, Hebrews chapter 12. And we'll read just verse 1. And this is what the author says. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up, and let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. Since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us cast everything aside that can hinder us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. This verse starts with an interesting word. It starts with the word therefore. Anytime we see the word therefore in the Bible, what must we ask? What must we assume? Something has come before. Something significant has come before. The author here is making this point based on something he has shared. And what came before chapter 12 in the book of Hebrews? What comes before chapter 12? Chapter 11. Okay, there's very obvious answers to a lot of the questions I'm posing here. Chapter 11. And in chapter 11 is what is known as the faith chapter. The great hall of fame, the great hall of faith, the men and women who lived by faith, the men and women who have been on this life journey, who have played this game of life, who have faced the same challenges and the same struggles that you and I have, who have had to deal with some of these tensions of I guess, being drawn to what is temporary and drawn to what is eternal, who have had to struggle with competing and comparing, but ultimately have come to the end of this race, come to the end of the game of life. And their names are found in this hall of fame. And it goes through from the beginning. The author writes, from Adam to Abel. He goes on to Noah, and then he says, Abraham, these great men of faith. He says after Abraham, his sons, Jacob, his son Isaac, Esau. He even mentions then Joseph, and he talks about how they trusted in God, how they determined to invest in what was eternal as opposed to what was temporal. And their names, like the bricks on the Hall of Fame and the Comrades Marathon, are pinned in this faith Hall of Fame. And I want us to read in chapter 11, just from verse 24, because it says it so beautifully and fits into what we're talking about. Verse 24, it was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasure of sin. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. Do you get that? Tells exactly, Moses lived his life understanding the principle that when the game is over, it all goes back in the box. And what made him a man of faith was living with this principle and the reality in sight that our reward is not here on earth. What we're doing, everything we're striving for, this race we're running, is not to keep score with what happens here on earth, but rather looking for what God has in store, what God has called each and every one of us to, and putting that as our goal, putting that as our prize. Those that suffered, it carries on in this Hall of Fame and talks about so many who were sawn in half, who were killed, so many who were tortured because of their faith. But they endured and they continued in this race. And this is why they made it in this great hall of faith. And he says, those that suffered, were tortured, live for the call of God. These are on the wall of remembrance. Their lives are to be an inspiration to you. Let them serve as a reminder when you face the desire to give up. When you are so lost in pain, the agony, the doubt, the fear, the uncertainty, the distance that still seems to lie ahead, and your reason shouts out, give up. All your body screams enough, and all your soul longs for peace and calm. You will face these moments in your journey. There will come a time when the call of God seems too great, too big, too scary. But here's my charge to you this morning. Don't give up. Determine this day to never, ever give up. This picture was posted on the wall in a classroom when I was a kid. And it's always stayed with me. Never, ever give up. Now, as I said to you, part of the reason why I watched this race on Sunday so intently was because some of my friends, some close friends, were actually busy running the race. And many of you might know her, Christia Chrysafis, formerly Christia Chrysafis, now Christia Wilcox. You see, after watching our parents run this race as kids, 2 children in our families have run this race. Sean, my brother, being one of them, and now Christia as well. And I want to share a little bit of what she wrote on her Facebook after the race, because this fits so well with what we're talking about today. And I'm going to draw some principles as we conclude our message. Here's what she says. Race is gun to gun. So even though it took 7 minutes to cross the start line, it isn't taken into account at the end. Was a little hypothermic 17 kilometers in. I was sleepy from the cold gusts of wind. Muscles aching, never had that before so early in a training run. But by 30 kilometers, I was not sure I'd be able to continue running with the pain and the cold. Was tracking about 35 minutes behind my set goal of halfway. The elevation, rise and fall can only be appreciated if you're there, with hills kilometers long. And the camber and undulation of the road made for quads and feet that screamed, stop. I burst into tears about 3 times in the race. But the race was true to its name. Fellow comrades buoyed me up. The support along the way from the spectators and volunteers is beyond amazing. Here's the principle that she touches on that I want us to understand when looking at this race of life, when looking at how we should be running and playing this game of life. And here's the principle. Winning alone is another form of losing. Winning alone and doing it alone is another form of losing. She continues writing, with 30 kilometers to go, a running bus, a pace setter group of about 100 people came up from behind. I realized if I didn't stick with them, I was toast. The leader of our group will forever be our hero. We ran at a quicker pace and then walked and ran and walked the way to the finish. I have to tell each of you, these are those that were part of that group, that it was only your encouragement that got me through. I wish I could mention you all by name in this post. Because you see, winning alone is another form of losing. I want to encourage each and every one of us. I believe our community, our church, is like this running bus. On this race of life, in the challenges that we're going to face, we're going to need each other. We're going to need someone who is helping us set pace, someone who is keeping us accountable, someone who is running alongside in the journey and saying, come on, you can do it. It's okay. Others have been there pointing out where others have succeeded or maybe where others have failed and helping you pace yourself in this journey, in this race of life. Everyone wanted to be around that pace setter. Everyone wanted to be close to him because they knew that if they could stay together as a group, together, they would make it. And Christia testified to that fact. If she hadn't stuck with the group, she's sure her race would have been over. Jesus talks about this. The original parable we shared on the very first talk, where he spoke about the rich man. That started off our series, where Jesus spoke about a rich man who got a lot of profit from his lands the one year, and he decided, I'm going to store all my grain and try and hoard it all for myself and get more. And so he broke down his barns, built bigger barns, and just invested in getting more and more as he accumulated and stored his wealth away. He then spoke, and through this whole story that Jesus is telling, this man never ever interacts with another human being. Instead, even when he's talking, he talks to himself. And he says, you know what, I'm going to say myself, look at everything you've stored. Look at everything, look at what you've achieved. How great is it? How awesome is it? And right at the end, God comes to the man and says what? You fool. You fool. You've invested in everything that is temporal. And you've done it alone. There's no one else with you. There's no one else you can talk to. It doesn't mention a family. It doesn't mention other people that he's supporting. It doesn't mention the others he tried to help with what he had. He spoke to himself, myself, look at what I have. And what is it all for? Because when the game is over, it all goes back in the box. So winning alone is another form of losing. An author writing about the game of Monopoly, he wrote a book about how to be successful in Monopoly. Okay, there's actually a book about that, how to win in Monopoly. And he says one of his guiding principles in how to be successful in Monopoly is to be the kind of person that others don't mind losing to. Did you get that? Be the kind of person that others don't mind losing to. In other words, be the kind of person that others want to have sitting next to them in the game. How do we do this? The principle he's talking about here is playing with grace. When we play and when we're involved in this game of life, play with grace. Win with grace. Lose with grace. No one likes a sore loser, do they? And who likes an arrogant winner? Okay. But the question is, how many of us have learned how to lose well? I know that was something that I never really learned. I was never taught that when going, the coach was instructing you. Actually, I lie. I remember now a volleyball coach actually helped and coached us with that. Actually taught us how to lose with dignity, how to lose with grace, how to lose and still walk off and not feel that, I'm any less than what I was or I'm any more than what I was when I first went into the game. And because he taught us this principle, I was part of the Longburn volleyball team at the time. For 3 years in a row, we won at the Adventist tournament. We won the prize for being the nicest team to play against. We never won anything else, but we managed to win the prize for being the nicest team to play against. And I was proud of that. I really was. Because this coach had taught us how to lose with grace. That it wasn't all about winning. Then the other thing that we need to understand is that losing is an essential part of life. No one can win or have success in everything that they do all the time. So how do we deal with that? If you're the kind of person that others want to sit next to in life, then you need to learn how to handle failure, hurt, disappointment, and how to handle it all with grace. You need to be able to forgive with grace. Other people are going to hurt you, sometimes trip you up on this race of life. But the Bible encourages us that if we're going to be the kind of person that others want to be with, we need to learn to forgive with grace. Peter actually came to Jesus the one time and asked him, said, Lord, if someone keeps doing something against me, how many times should I forgive him? If someone keeps doing that same thing that I've asked them not to and that they've even said sorry to before, but they keep doing it, how many times should I forgive them? 7? I mean, Jesus, you often talk about the number 7, the perfect number. Maybe that's it. 7, is that? And what was Jesus' response? Jesus said, no. You forgive 70 times 7. He wasn't actually giving a determinant factor on how many times we should forgive. He was trying to communicate the principle to Peter that forgiveness doesn't have a limit. Grace has no barrier, has no boundary. Grace has no measure. Forgiveness and forgiving with grace is what God has called us to do. But the reality that the Bible talks about, it says, humanly, is that possible? Humanly, in and of ourselves, we can't do that. We can only give as much grace as we have received. We can only give as much grace as we have received from God. How do we lose with grace? Then if you want to be the kind of person that others want to sit next to, we need to be able to win with grace as well. And being gracious in winning is one of the greatest tests of character, because then ultimately I have to recognize that the winning is not all about me. The final portion of Christia's blog, she says this: your well wishes got us through. We love you all. P.S. Dad and I never found each other along the course. We were seated in different categories at the start, he ahead of me. I spent the whole race thinking, jolly Dad beat me, only to arrive at the end and see him scrape through right before the gun went off. He literally finished with 8 seconds to spare. He is the true hero. He is the true hero. As Karen reminded us, it's ultimately not about me. It's about God. Turn just lastly to Hebrews chapter 12 again. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. In continuing, the author there says, remember in verse 1, he said, let us run the race. Let us draw courage from the great cloud of witnesses. And let us cast off everything that may hinder us, and let us run the race with endurance. Then he says, how do we do this? We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. How do we run this race of life? How do we play the game? We need to keep our eyes on Jesus. He is the one who initiates and perfects, and he's the champion in this race. I want you to look in the seat pocket in front of you. There should be little cards like this, and I want you all just to grab a little card, and on the front it has the verse we've been looking at here in Hebrews chapter 12. And that's just a reminder for you to take home and to encourage you in this journey of life to run with endurance, with your eyes on Jesus. But at the back, I want us to do a little exercise. You'll see at the back it's got a section where you can put a date, a dash, and then another section where you can put a date. And in the first section, I want you to put your date of birth. Okay. If you're shy about your date of birth, you can hide it from the person next to you or whatever it may be, but I want you to write in there your date of birth. Then in the next section, and if you don't have a pen, just do it imaginarily, draw with your finger. Then in the next section, I want you to put a question mark, because that signifies your date of death. And we don't know when that is. No one knows when that is. Now, when you look at your date of birth, did you have any decision Did you have any part to play in your date of birth? Did you have any choice in the matter? This is just when you arrived, isn't it? You had no choice. You had nothing to do with, and you had no say over the date that you arrived in this world. And then when we look at the other one, the question mark, the date of death, do any of us really have any say in that one either? Do any of us know when it's going to be? Can any of us stop it or choose to avoid it in any way, shape, or form? They say there's two certainties in life. Your mother loves you and you're going to die. Or the other one was you've got to pay taxes. Maybe they're three. Okay. We don't know what's going to happen or when we're going to die. But what I do want you to look at and just think about and reflect on is the dash in between. Because you see, that dash in between represents the time that you and I have between those two dates. Represents the choice and the life, this journey that you and I are on in life between those two dates. Those two dates we've got no say over, we've got no choice in the matter, we've got nothing we can do about it. But what matters and what counts is not when you are born or when you died, but it's what you did with the dash and how you played this game of life and who ultimately you put your faith and your trust in. Because there's only two options. You can either put your faith and your trust in yourself, in what is temporal, in what is fleeting, or you can put your faith and trust in God, who is eternal, who gives us hope, gives us promise, and a future. It's your choice.